Hello, welcome to today's video. This video was a bit of an ordeal, mainly because I couldn't find a good set of data already in Daisy Hill, so I needed to reach out and find some additional information. And being near an election day, I decided that election data was a good place to start, which meant I had to create the data, and we'll get in talking a little bit more about that in a minute. But what I want to do is to explain how a data mart can do much more for you than just building a reporting data set. So what are these advantages? I like to build data marts. I'm a data architect. I do data modeling. I like to make things that are persistent and extensive and that you can reuse in the future. Of course, if you're under the gun and you're trying to do something right now and there's bosses staring over your shoulder, you probably don't want to take the extra time. But if you can do a little bit of this work at the begin with and to see where you're going with it and expand it out in the future, because I have found one thing, you would never look at a set of data just once. People always want to see more for the data that you've gotten. And so one of the big advantages of building a data mart, building something a bit more relational and extensible, is that it gives you flexible reporting. That means that the next time you're ready to do the report, you don't have to start all over from the beginning. You have something that you can base it upon with a good data set and expanding out that data set or bringing an additional piece of information along the way. And that also brings in the second piece of this, which is no repetitive development. As you might know, if you're looking at a data set and building a reporting table every time, you're going to go back and repeating those pieces of the work. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about a bit just is how good Alteryx is. I no longer able to show you Alteryx as I've lost my license, but that's okay. With your Alteryx, you can pull out pieces of your workflow and build from there. If you're using something like Java or another high-level language, you can do the same thing. I myself have started using a bit more Java in my daily work, and so therefore I can build upon some of those classes that I've already built and put them together and extend them, and I don't start from the beginning. You can do this. You can't really do the same thing with SQL. The problem with SQL is that even though you have a core of a query ready to go, adding things to it can become more complicated. So if you're actually looking at building the data set just once, you don't have to repeat that development or figure out how to do it. I also like data marts because once you explain how to use a nice little data mart to a reporting analyst, they're finding it much easier to drop it into the reporting tool to see their data and figure out how to use the data, as well as some things I do along the way help you get those reports generated a lot quicker, because after all, that is where the work needs to be applied, which is getting the report put together and going out. The old adage that we've done for years within database design and development is build it once, report it often. So if you take some time at the very beginning and build out a nice structure, you can do a lot of reporting from that structure. Doing it once takes a little extra time and you can get over with it as well. Now going back to Alteryx, you'll see that separating out data with Alteryx is very easy to do. However, doing the data that I had to do to generate my data set was a bit tougher because I didn't have Alteryx. I had to use SQL primarily, and that slows me down, but it is not impossible. Let's take a look at what we're trying to solve. It's always nice to know where I'm headed, not just showing you how to build a data mart, but why am I building this data mart? Well, the IT department at Daisy Hill has been very successful with extending themselves out and outreaching into our community. The elections administration for the county has asked us to generate a couple of reports for them. They have an extract of data that they sent to us, and they wanted us to go ahead and show them what can be done with it. It is a very small set of data for just for the current election, but they do want to bring in historical data and begin to store it and do additional reporting. And obviously they've scrubbed any personal information out of it. So we wanted to do a little proof of concept to show them they can do votes by day by city and put their data into a nice easy to use and efficient data mart. What does the solution entail? Well, this video is going to go ahead and bring that source data in and generate a simple report. We're going to talk about why to create the data mart. We've sort of done this now, but we'll be doing that if we look at each of the pieces. We'll be choosing dimensions and talking about why and how I chose those dimensions, what attributes to put in the dimension and fact tables, how you can build your data mart independent of your tool set. I did mine with SQL. I use a little bit of Java on the side to get me over a few rough patches, but primarily I did it with just SQL. I'm using Access. It's not very friendly or extensible, but if you're using an RDBMS, you can do a lot. I stood up an entire data mart before just using stored procedures within Oracle. So if you have something like that available to you, that makes your life easier. And then finally at the very end, we will build a very simple report. I'll use Excel for this because Excel is not great at reporting, but in a data mart, we've done most of the work for the reporting tool. So actually doing the report is fairly easy. So let's take a look at my source data. Again, I'm a big believer in building your own test data when you're working with something new or complicated, as opposed to always just accepting the data that's fed to you. We can look at this in two ways. I always like to look at things from a data modeling standpoint. It gives me a vision of what's going to happen and where I'm at. And we'll go ahead and bring in the vote data, which is vote source. So here is my vote source data. It has a vote ID that's assigned by the system as the vote comes in. It has the election date and the election code and a description for that election. Again, this is just flat data being sent to us, not data being pulled out of a table. We have the city and the zip code, the vote timestamp, gender, age, whether or not the yes or no for if they were early voted, mail-in voted, whether it was their first time they voted, or whether they actually did in-person voting. Generating this data was a lot of fun. Random numbers are very useful. I found out that Access does not have a good random number generator. If you're using Alteryx, Alteryx has a great random number generator and great ways of using the different widgets to generate your data. But I was able to build this data set out of some random stubs of data that I had laying around, and the or miscellaneous stubs of data I had laying around, and the random numbers were generated out of Java. It gave me a thinking ahead. I generated a 5,000 by 5 matrix of random numbers that I could use for different purposes, but essentially then we have the voter ID starting at 1. Sorry about that. This is the election date that we have just had. It is the Texas midterms election. It's a general Texas midterm, etc. We have a couple of cities, north, south, east, west, and central. Again, I'm not the person to generate really awesome test data. I tend to be a bit blasé in generating some of the data. Generated a few zip codes. We have some random voting timestamps. Male and female for votes, voter ages between 18 and I think it was 100 actually, but maybe not quite that far. I'd have to look through here. And then yes and no flags for the different attributes. Again, if you're going to take a good hard look at this data, don't try to, because some of this data may not actually make sense. It's just randomly generated to see what the situations are. Having gotten that data, then the next step is to go ahead and build a data mart. When you look at a data mart, the first thing you want to deal with is your dimensions. And in building this, we have a number of different types of dimensions as well as different flavors of dimensions that I'm going to use to solve this problem. So the first dimension to bring in is actually the easiest one because I keep it laying around all the time, and I have some videos where we talk about my date dimension and how important it is to have a robust date dimension for your data warehousing and your reporting needs. And so we obviously have a number of dates that we want to include in our fact table, so we'll bring in my standard date dimension. Let's take a look at some of the simpler things, and we can bring in our election dimension because obviously we have at least one dimension going on now. We might have multiple elections. So we have an election dimension. Again, I like to assign a warehouse ID to these just to make it easier to pass around information. Developers tend to like to have IDs as their primary keys. It turns out a lot of the tools sort of rely upon that and make the development easier to have such a thing. So we want to go ahead and we have the election code that's coming in and the election name. And how we will get this is bringing this unique value out of, or any unique values out of our data source and populating them in here and assigning a warehouse ID. This is a very small dimension at this time. It will only have one record in it. Let's take a look at something slightly different, and we'll talk about the vote dimension because we do have that vote ID coming in. And in bringing that in, I've decided to go ahead and assign a warehouse ID and then have the vote ID as one of the attributes in this dimension. You may say, why not just use the vote ID? Well, the thought process here is that the vote ID itself might be personal privileged information, or PPI, or whatever it is you wish to call safety information, that we might not want to expose to everybody that has access to this data. We would hide this so that it becomes privileged and not accessible. I would build a view on top of this so that if it is indeed privileged, only certain people could see a view that exposes the vote ID, and the rest of the users would only see the WID, or the generated warehouse ID, and that sort of ties together what else might be going on within this data set. You could argue you might not actually need this dimension and you just leave the ID off, but that means it makes it harder to do any kind of maintenance work on this data. So we have our vote, we have our election. What else we need out of this? Well, obviously we have a city. So we want to go ahead and pull in a city dimension. Again, this is a very simple and straightforward dimension. It has the city name. Now, when we talk about making a more robust environment, you might want to look at pulling some additional information in about the city, such as the state that it's in, or other attributes associated with that city. But in this case, we're keeping it very simple. It brought us up a perplexing little issue, which is the zip code dimension. Obviously, there is a relationship between the cities and the zip codes. Some cities might have more than one zip code. And in a relational database, we would resolve this, but in a dimensional database, we don't actually have to resolve it unless there's something that we want to do with it. For example, if we want to roll up zip codes into their cities, then we might want to do something which is a grouping dimension. We might make a fact dimension as well. Well, not fact dimension, but a fact table to associate cities and zip codes as a factless fact table. And because there might be some other information associated with that relationship. But for this purposes, we just went ahead and said, we'll just keep these independent and separate. We could always leave it to the reporting to rationalize these two out, but we really didn't see a need to do it or to get that extensive in building this data set with these in here as well. Now I brought in another dimension. It happens to be the age dimension. And you might say, why the heck did you bring in an age dimension? Can't that just be a metric? And the answer is yes. In a lot of cases, the age could be considered a metric since it is, after all, a number, and we can make it a metric in there. But there's something that we might want to do additionally with the ages from a reporting standpoint. So we went ahead and added a warehouse ID. It just turns out that the warehouse ID is the age, but we went ahead and made one of the attributes the age value as well, just to round it out and make it so you don't have to know that the age dimensions ID is the same as your actual age. We put an English text in there to say that if you're 42, 43, 44, etc., we can put it in English. Some people like to see that. This is where also you could put in some additional attributions associated with it, such as are they young, old, etc. So you can build upon this age dimension either with some additional attributes or within a fact table as well, if you want to do it that way, so that you can bring in some more information about an age, and we could expand this out in the future. And what we're doing here is setting the groundwork for a more robust federated dimensional data store, because we might want to use this age for something other than the direct purpose that we have for it in this example or this data set. And then to round this out, the very last happens to be my gender dimension. That's sort of an easy one to use because we have a gender code, and we went ahead and just want to add in a gender name, and you might have some other attributes associated with this as well, but this makes it pretty simple to go through. We again add an ID to it because it's a lot nicer adding IDs around. And then we have the gender code, male, female, and in some states you have more than 2 gender codes, and then a name for the gender as well. So things are pretty stable now from a dimension standpoint. This is what I would like to see inside of here, so that all that we need to do now is to round this out by building a fact table. So we will bring in our design for the fact table, and then suddenly here are all of our relationships. So each of the dimensions is represented as a relationship and a specific name for that attribute other than just the width. And we also want to go ahead, and this is sort of where the trick and knowledge of having done this for many years is, that we want to turn those yes no's into ones and zeros. Let me repeat that. Take the yes no's, turn them into indicators of a 1 or a 0. And what this does is it allows us to, when we're reporting, not have to translate those. They're actually now a metric, so that I can sum those. I can sum and do an average or some other ratios associated with the percentage of early votes against total votes, etc. And again, I don't have to do any translation of the data. I can just do sums of this information now and get my reporting done much more readily. Take a look at this piece of data set as we go into it. Let's look at our voter fact, and you can see that we have the warehouse ID that was assigned to the vote, and then the IDs associated with the other pieces of information. And then finally we have our metrics, which are the indicators, a 0 meaning that they don't count as an early vote, and a 1 meaning that they do count as an early vote. Pretty simple when you look at it this way, but it took us a bit of trouble to get to that point and defining our dimensions and then manipulating our data on the way in to translate between the incoming source data and the dimension data and fact metrics that we wanted to expose. So the final step of this process is to go ahead and generate a report. Wanted to be able to do so easily. And as I don't have a reporting tool readily available to me, I've been doing a lot of reporting in Excel. Now, if you've ever dealt with me in the past and in my training sessions that I've done at the corporate level, I tend to downplay or talk a little negatively about Excel, and it's good to note that Excel is actually a good tool to use if you don't have something better. It can do all the things that you would do. It can actually do some ETL kind of work and data manipulations and generation. It also does some pretty nice little reporting things as far as not only graphics, but pie charts as well as tables. So I sort of dove into something a little bit different within this exercise, but basically if I look at my data, it is very simple to show that the sum of the early votes by day with a separate line for each of the cities. And you can see that we had a lot of voting going on 11/7 as far as the early voting is concerned. Again, if you look and say, well, wait a minute, you have early voting on the 8th. Don't look at my data. I did the best I could with generating this. But you can see that it is a nice little report. You can turn this over. We generated a second graph, which is the sum of in-person votes, and it sort of follows the same pattern. So my random numbering isn't all that good, but you can look at these two and see that they are indeed different. So my data came in slightly differently. And again, it based on how I got this data to start with. And how did I generate this? And this will talk about the ease of reporting. So I don't want to do a lot of extensive data manipulation and preparation within Excel in order to do the reporting. I really want to be able to take the data straight out of my dimensional data mart and put it into this. And the answer is that I can. The way that I got this data is with the starting out with just simply a blank spreadsheet. We go into data and we have queries and connections. And what I did first was define a connection to my Access database, pulled in a couple of tables, and then I began to work on individual queries from there. By default, it came up when I attached to the vote fact and the city dimension, which were the two pieces of information that I used to generate this. I then began to work off of this vote fact. And what I do is actually created some steps. I have source, which is the table that I had, which the inside of the Access database. I navigated to a specific table. I merged two queries. I put city and dimension along with the vote fact table. I added some attributes from the city dimension. I removed the columns that I didn't need. I did some column reordering. And again, all this is done graphically just by dragging and dropping and clicking and choosing. And then finally, I went ahead and grouped by doing a sum of the indicators and created early vote sums, in-person vote sums, and main vote sums as well. Once I did that, I was then able to generate a chart, and I used a multi-line chart. And then I just simply ran it, and it gave me this data. I wanted to do a second chart of the early votes as opposed to the vote fact, and what I did there is I duplicated the vote fact into vote fact 2 and simply changed the attribute that was being used in the, let's come back to here, the attributes that were being used inside of the pivot chart fields. Now I would say that this was fairly simple and straightforward. The answer is it sort of was. If you're into Excel reporting and you can do this, you might find a better way of doing it than me. If you're having some questions about this, go ahead and drop me a comment, send me an email and say, hey, show us a little bit more about reporting in Excel, and I'll do my best to put something together. But again, I tend to do Excel reporting as a brand new experience each time I do it, because I find different ways of dealing with the data and how to get and use the data. But this one I decided to pull directly out of my Access database, which means you can pull it out of any database. Given that, I'm able to then take and share this data along with the data model and the report output with the voting people. and say, if this is what you want, we can help you build it. If you have some better tools than I have, I can show you how to build both the data set and the reports with your more advanced tools than those that I have. But the main thing to look at is the fact that we wanted to get our source table into this dimensional data mart because it eases your reporting. So again, as I've always said, here's some more pictures. Quick summary of what we did is that the data mart created opportunities for future reporting as well as dealt with our current reporting pretty easily. You can use any tool available to you. The better the tool, the easier your development is, the more repeatable it is, more extensible it is, and the more fun that you will have in the positive sense as opposed to the fun that I had in the negative sense for populating this. The point is to choose good dimensions and to extend those dimensions over time. Build your fact table to be your ease of reporting. Indicators are much easier than yes or no flags. So pick those good metrics. Pick as many metrics as you need. Pre-calculate things if they need to be pre-calculated so that your reporting tool doesn't have to calculate them for you. You can do things like roll up facts and other types of fact tables to help with your reporting as well. I hope you found this useful. I had fun doing it. Again, subscribe, drop me comments, let me know if you like this, have any questions, what you would like to see next. I appreciate y'all being out there, and so y'all have a great day.